In every war, there are weapons that roar and burn and dominate the photographs. Battleships, bombers, tanks. And then there are the quiet killers, the devices hidden inside steel and circuitry that never get their own monuments, but change everything. In the Pacific War, under the blazing sun and over the black depths of the ocean, one of those quiet killers was born. To the Japanese, it looked like sorcery. To the Americans, it felt like a miracle. To the men who died by it, it came without warning at all. This is the story of the VT proximity fuse, a tiny, secret brain hidden in the nose of a 5-inch shell. A weapon that turned near misses into kills, stripped Japanese pilots of their one great advantage, and helped turn the sky from a hunting ground into a graveyard. To understand how a handful of scientists in a converted garage helped decide battles thousands of miles away, we have to start where every story about anti-aircraft fire begins, with failure. In the early years of the Pacific War, the U.S. Navy sailed under a sky that might as well have belonged to the enemy. From Pearl Harbor through the brutal fighting around the Solomons, every air raid alarm meant the same thing for American sailors. They were about to fight for their lives with weapons that were, in practice, almost blind. The 5-inch dual-purpose guns, the proud backbone of American shipboard anti-aircraft defense, were powerful, loud, and impressive. But against fast maneuvering Japanese aircraft, they were nearly useless. The problem lay not in the steel of the guns or the courage of the crews, but in the tiny piece of hardware that decided when each shell would explode. The fuse. These guns used time fuses. Before each round was fired, a crewman had to set a small mechanical timer based on where the target would be when the shell reached its estimated altitude and range. That meant the gunners had to solve a brutal equation in real time. Target bearing, altitude, speed, heading, rate of climb or descent, plus the time of flight for the shell itself. It was three-dimensional predictive shooting under combat pressure, with seconds to decide. In theory, with perfect data and a steady target, it could work. In reality, the targets were Japanese pilots who had survived Pearl Harbor, the Indian Ocean raids, and the early battles of the Pacific. Men who knew exactly how to make those calculations fail. Japanese aviators had quickly learned the rhythm of American anti-aircraft fire. They saw how the black puffs of timed bursts usually clustered along a predicted path, forming a deadly line in the sky that could be dodged if you refused to fly straight. So they turned each attack run into a vicious dance. As they approached a ship, they jinked left and right, climbed suddenly, then dropped again, rolling and yawing just enough to throw off the American aim. Every abrupt maneuver shifted their future position by hundreds of feet by the time the shells arrived. To the men behind the guns, those maneuvers were the difference between a kill and a meaningless explosion in empty air. To the pilots, it became almost a game, deadly but familiar. They knew that as long as they kept changing speed and altitude, the American shells would detonate where they should have been, not where they actually were. The cold numbers told a story in language no one could ignore. By 1941 and early 1942, statistical reports showed that it took around 2,000 5-inch shells to bring down a single enemy aircraft. 2,000 shells, each weighing over 50 pounds, each costing precious wartime dollars, each demanding sweat and muscle to load and fire. A destroyer often carried roughly 400 rounds of 5-inch ammunition. That meant an entire ship shooting itself dry might be lucky to down one plane. Lucky was not a word any admiral wanted tied to his fleet's main anti-aircraft weapon. Meanwhile, Japanese attacks rarely came as solitary intruders. They arrived in groups, dozens of dive bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters sweeping down in coordinated strikes. 20, 30, 50 aircraft could be in the air over a task force at once, each one carrying bombs or torpedoes capable of crippling or sinking a ship. Against that storm of steel and fire, American ships were trying to protect themselves with a weapon that statistically could barely handle even a single attacker. On the gun decks, the men felt the imbalance in their bones. They stood strapped into open mounts, eyes burning from cordite, ears ringing from the crash of their own guns. Shell after shell slammed into breeches, fuse setters spun and clicked. Barrels recoiled and returned to battery. the sky above them filled with thick, dirty blossoms of black smoke, explosions that looked impressive, sounded terrifying, and far too often burst in utterly the wrong place. Some detonated too early, far below the climbing planes. Others went off too late, high above the diving aircraft, leaving them untouched as they bored in. The gunners could see their mistakes written in the sky like accusations, puffs behind the target, or leading it by a second too much. In that 1 second, the aircraft had already moved on. It wasn't that American gunners were unskilled. Far from it. Many were seasoned, drilled endlessly in range finding, fuse setting, and fire control. They had the Mark 37 directors, optical rangefinders, and a growing network of radar to help. But no amount of human skill could fully overcome the tyranny of time and motion. A shell took several seconds to reach the altitude of the attacking aircraft. In those seconds, a single small change in the plane's flight path invalidated all the careful work done by the fire control crews. Once the fuse was set and the shell left the barrel, fate took over. And fate in those years did not favor the Americans. The problem wasn't unique to the U.S. Navy. The Royal Navy, once considered masters of naval gunnery, had already learned the same bitter lesson in the narrow seas around Britain. German bombers of the Luftwaffe repeatedly battered British ships despite heavy anti-aircraft fire. It became increasingly clear that this was not a question of bravery, training, or doctrine. It was physics. Traditional time fuses turned anti-aircraft gunnery into a form of high-stakes fortune-telling. You did not fire at where the plane was. You fired at where you hoped it would be several seconds into the future. And hope, as battles from the Channel to the Coral Sea showed, was a poor shield against bombs and torpedoes. The psychological toll on American crews was immense. They watched friends burned or smashed to death by shrapnel when bombs found their mark. They felt their ships shudder as near misses from Japanese bombs lifted thousands of tons of steel partially out of the water. They heard the roaring approach of dive bombers, the rising scream of falling bombs, the final gut-deep crash as explosives detonated. And through it all, they kept loading, aiming, firing, knowing that statistically almost everything they fired would explode in empty sky. Yet they had no choice. When the klaxons wailed and someone shouted, "Bogies inbound," men ran not because they believed their guns were efficient, but because those guns were all they had. They clung to the small, bitter comfort that sometimes, out of thousands of rounds, one shell would burst close enough to tear the wing from a bomber or shatter a cockpit. That one rare hit might be the difference between their ship living or dying. For the admirals in Washington and Pearl Harbor, this reality was more than unacceptable. It was unsustainable. A Navy that could not protect itself from the air was a Navy living on borrowed time. American industry could build ships at a staggering pace, but building hulls meant nothing if those hulls were doomed every time the enemy sent aircraft against them. Something fundamental had to change, not in the size of the guns or the number of barrels, but in the very heart of the ammunition. Before the VT fuse existed, that was the shape of the war at sea. Mighty ships bristling with guns, firing thousands of rounds into the sky, trying to swat down fast, agile attackers with what was essentially glorified guesswork. Anti-aircraft fire wasn't truly a weapon of precision. It was a barrage of hope and fear, thrown upward in the desperate belief that sheer volume might somehow compensate for the cold, merciless math of the battlefield. By mid-1940, while American ships fought for survival in the Pacific and British warships burned under the Luftwaffe's bombs, a very different kind of battle was taking place far from the front lines, quiet, hidden, and fought not with steel or explosives, but with equations, soldering irons, and raw imagination. It started in a small building in Washington, D.C., at the Carnegie Institution's Department of Terrestrial Magnetism, where Dr. Merle Anthony Tuve sat at his desk staring at a request from the U.S. Navy that seemed less like a weapons specification and more like a challenge to the laws of physics. The Navy wanted a fuse that didn't rely on hope or timing or guesswork. They wanted a fuse that could sense an airplane, one that could detonate automatically the moment it passed near a target, as if it had eyes. To the Navy, the request bordered on desperation. To the scientists who received it, the request bordered on impossible. Tuve understood instantly what the Navy was asking. Not a new shell, not a new gun, but a weapon that could think. A shell that could decide the moment of its own destruction with deadly, almost instinctive awareness. A device so small it could fit into the nose of a 5-inch round, yet so tough it could survive the hellish violence of being fired from a naval gun. Most engineers would have declined. Most physicists would have said it couldn't be done. Tuve, however, did something else entirely. He assembled a team. He called in James Van Allen, young, brilliant, hungry, the man who would one day discover Earth's radiation belts. He recruited Lloyd Berkner, a genius in radio engineering. He brought in experts on batteries, electronics, vacuum tubes, and metallurgy. In a world where armies were preparing to kill each other with steel and fire, Tuve gathered men who fought with voltmeters and slide rules. The first meeting was brutally honest. Tuve laid out the challenges, each one sounding like a death sentence for the idea. First, the miniature radar system they envisioned would need a vacuum tube receiver and transmitter. But traditional vacuum tubes were fragile, thin glass sculptures designed for radios, not weapons. Even a minor bump could crack one. A 5-inch naval gun produced 20,000 Gs of acceleration at the moment of firing, enough force to turn hardened steel into putty and smash fragile electronics into dust. Second, the shell would spin at nearly 30,000 revolutions per minute, a tornado of centrifugal force that threatened to rip every solder joint, every filament, every connection apart from the inside. Third, inside the cramped steel body of the shell, there was barely enough room for a pound of explosive, much less a radar system. The available space was roughly the volume of a milk bottle, and even that space had to include batteries, safety devices, detonation circuits, and the sensor itself. Fourth, the fuse had to be safe inside the gun barrel, activate itself only after firing, work at extreme temperatures, and remain reliable even after months of storage and rough handling. Each problem alone could have ended the project. Together, they formed a technological wall that no one had ever climbed. But Tuve's team did what wartime scientists did best. They started breaking the impossible into pieces. Van Allen attacked the vacuum tube problem like a man possessed. He built test rigs that crushed tubes with mechanical hammers, blasted them with shock waves, and sent them down test barrels. 90% shattered. The ones that didn't were tested again. He tried thicker glass, new geometry, improved cushioning, and redesigned internal filaments. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the tubes survived more often. 30% reliability, then 35, then 40. To the scientists, these numbers still felt like failure. To the Navy, desperate for anything better than zero, 30% felt like salvation. Meanwhile, Berkner and others worked on the radio circuitry. The concept was simple on paper. The shell would emit continuous radio waves ahead of its flight path. If the waves bounced off a metal aircraft and returned stronger as the shell approached, the electronics would detect the spike and detonate. Radar in miniature, a hunter's instinct inside steel. In practice, nothing was simple. The circuit had to ignore waves bouncing from clouds, waves scattering from water, static from electrical storms. It had to respond in milliseconds because the shell traveled more than 2,000 feet per second. A delay of even 1/100th of a second meant missing the target. Every part had to be so rugged that firing it wouldn't destroy it, yet so sensitive that it could detect faint radio reflections in the chaos of combat. And then there were the batteries, small, inert, and dead inside the shell until the instant of firing, when the shock would activate their chemicals and give the fuse just a few seconds of power. Designing such a battery alone would have filled an engineer's career. But here it was only one piece of a monstrous puzzle. By early 1942, the project outgrew its cramped rooms. The Navy partnered with Johns Hopkins to create the Applied Physics Laboratory, the now famous APL, inside a converted car dealership that still smelled of motor oil. The team moved in among the dismantled car lifts and grease-stained floors, building the future of naval warfare in a place designed to sell used Buicks. Factories across America were pulled quietly into the secret. The Crosley Corporation, maker of radios and refrigerators, retooled entire assembly lines to stamp out fuse components. General Electric converted a Christmas light facility into a vacuum tube production plant. Over 100 companies, 10,000 workers, most unaware of what they were actually building, became soldiers in a war of electronics. The secrecy was suffocating. Workers were told only the bare minimum. Even sailors who loaded the shells aboard warships didn't know how they functioned. The fuse was labeled VT, a deliberately misleading code suggesting variable time, to hide its true nature. Secrecy was not paranoia, it was survival. If Japan captured even one intact fuse, they could study it, jam it, or build their own. The entire advantage would vanish. By late 1942, after thousands of failures and endless nights of grinding experimentation, the scientists had created a working prototype. A fuse small enough, strong enough, smart enough to ignite at the perfect moment. For the first time in history, a shell could think. The proximity fuse, VT fuse, was ready for war. And on a January morning in 1943, on the decks of USS Helena, Japanese pilots would learn what it meant when a shell no longer guessed where a plane would be. It simply sensed it. They never understood what killed them. Dawn on January 5, 1943, rose slowly over the Solomon Islands, turning the sea into a sheet of burnished steel. Aboard the cruiser USS Helena, Lieutenant Commander William "Red" Cochran stood inside the 5-inch gun director, headphones pressed to his ears, eyes fixed on the horizon. For hours, the ship had been at general quarters. No one spoke. Every man could feel the tension, the kind that made the air feel thick, electric, waiting to ignite. The lookouts were the first to see them, tiny black specks emerging from the morning haze. Then the radio cracked alive with a voice tight and sharp. Bogies inbound, bearing 040, range 12,000 yards. 2 Japanese Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers dropped out of the clouds, engines snarling as they curved toward Helena. Their pilots were veterans, men who had fought at Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, Midway. They had survived American anti-aircraft fire dozens of times. They knew its rhythm, its weakness. They knew how to dodge it, and they expected the same dance today. They began their attack run in the familiar pattern: slow dive, slight zigzag, shallow angle, then a rapid descent. They expected the American shells to burst behind them. Too early, too late, always just off the mark. They expected black puffs of smoke, noise, and nothing more. They did not expect what happened next. Cochran barked orders into the sound-powered phones. His crews loaded the new shells, the secret shells, into the 5-inch mounts. None of the sailors knew exactly how these fuses worked. They'd been told only one thing: if you fire them, don't look for the burst. You won't see it. You'll see what's left of the plane. The guns thundered. 3 salvos, 5 or 6 rounds. The Japanese pilots saw the flashes. They began their usual evasive dance: a shallow roll, a hard bank, a quick dive. Movements that had saved them 100 times before. But the sky had changed. Physics had changed. The rules had changed. Halfway through a turn, the first pilot felt a shockwave of air hammer his aircraft. A split second later, his wings tore away as if ripped off by invisible claws. There had been no visible burst, no black puff to dodge, only sudden annihilation. The second aircraft tried to pull up, its pilot suddenly confused, instinct screaming that something was wrong. Before he could finish the maneuver, a blast tore through his fuselage. Fire, shrapnel, silence. Both aircraft disintegrated in midair, shredded not by luck, not by a lucky hit, but by a fuse that knew when to explode. Back on Helena, sailors stared at the sky with stunned disbelief. They had fired fewer than 10 rounds, and 2 enemy aircraft were gone. Moments of silence followed, silence filled with a new kind of awe. This wasn't just a new weapon. It was something close to unnatural, something that felt alive. But for the Japanese pilots who survived that day, awe turned into terror. The sky turns against them. Word spread in Japanese air units almost immediately, whispered in ready rooms and over mess tables. The American shells, they follow you. The explosions, they know where you are. The sky itself has become a weapon. Experienced pilots returned from missions shaken, describing bursts that appeared not in clusters or predictable lines, but exactly where their planes happened to be. Some reported feeling the pressure wave on their canopy as a shell detonated just feet away, something that had been virtually impossible before 1943. Flight Petty Officer Saburo Sakai, one of the greatest aces in the Imperial Navy, returned to Rabaul after an attack run in February. He had fought the Americans for years. He had survived more battles than almost any pilot alive. Nothing rattled him. But that day he climbed out of his zero trembling. He told the intelligence officers that the air around him had simply exploded. Not ahead of him, not behind him, not above or below, but right beside his wings, as if the shells had eyes. His wingman had vanished mid-flight. One instant, a living aircraft. The next, a cloud of fire and metal fragments blown sideways by a detonation Sakai didn't even see. The officers questioning him thought he was exaggerating. They assumed the American fuse setters had simply improved. But Sakai shook his head. No, he insisted. They did not guess. The shells knew. Within months, similar reports flooded Japanese air bases from Truk to Bougainville. Pilots, even seasoned ones, were coming home terrified. They had learned every trick to survive American-timed fuses. They had trained for years to exploit American weaknesses. But now those weaknesses were gone. The Americans no longer cared about predicting altitude or flight path. They no longer needed to lead a target. They no longer had to pray for luck. Their shells hunted. The statistics of fear. Before the VT fuse, Japanese pilots attacking a U.S. task force had a roughly 75% chance of survival. The sky was dangerous, yes, but predictable. Skilled pilots could outfly the bursts. By mid-1943, survival dropped to 60%. By late 1943, it was around 50%. A coin flip. And every month it fell further. Pilots began refusing to fly straight long enough to line up proper bomb runs. They dove too fast, released too early, or missed entirely. Their accuracy collapsed under the psychological weight of a weapon they could not understand. The Japanese Navy called the new American fire control black magic. They weren't entirely joking. A new kind of confidence for American crews. For the Americans, the emotional shift was equally dramatic, but in the opposite direction. Before VT fuses, anti-aircraft crews felt like they were throwing rocks at birds. They fired because duty demanded it, not because they believed it would work. Many had watched bombers fly through hundreds of bursts unscathed. Many had felt the helplessness of firing thousands of rounds only to watch a ship beside them take a torpedo or bomb. But now everything changed. A shell fired meant a real chance of a kill. A burst in the air meant destruction, not wasted steel. Gun crews began calling the VT rounds smart shells, thinking shells, even our guardian angels. For the first time, the sailors on the gun decks believed they could defend their ship, and belief matters in war. It changes how a man fights. It changes how he reacts when the alarms howl and the sky fills with predators. The VT fuse didn't just kill planes, it killed despair. The Japanese try to adapt and fail. Japanese commanders were not blind. They saw the casualty reports. They noticed pilots failing to return from missions that should have been routine. They noticed American guns firing fewer rounds but achieving more kills. They tried everything. Low-altitude attack runs, high-speed dives, split-second zigzags, tight formations, loose formations, night attacks, wave attacks. Nothing worked. The VT fuse had changed the mathematics of survival. Where before a pilot needed only to be unpredictable, now unpredictability simply meant the shell detonated wherever he happened to dodge. In a brutal twist of irony, maneuvering made VT fuses more effective, not less. The shell didn't care about altitude or direction. It cared only about proximity. To pilots trained from the academy to exploit the weaknesses of time fuses, this felt like sorcery. One Japanese officer wrote in a memo, "It is as though the American shells can smell us." The sky was no longer theirs. By the end of 1943, Japanese aviators faced a nightmare. American fighters tearing them apart at long range, and American shells ripping them apart at close range. Every approach, every attack run, every moment spent inside 5-inch range was a moment borrowed from death. The VT fuse did not just destroy aircraft, it destroyed confidence. doctrine, and the illusion that skill alone could guarantee survival. For the first time in the Pacific War, the skies began to belong to the Americans. And Japanese pilots felt it. They felt it every time they saw a burst without warning, every time a wingman vanished, every time they returned to base and found fewer planes parked than when they left. The Americans had changed the rules. They had turned the sky into a minefield. They had armed empty air with intelligence. And Japanese naval aviation would never recover from the shock. The fuse that broke an air doctrine. By late 1943, deep inside the command rooms of the Imperial Japanese Navy, a grim silence hung over every operational briefing. Thick folders filled with combat reports lay on long wooden tables. Officers studied them with tightening jaws, page after page of statistics that all pointed to the same terrifying truth. Japanese naval aviation was dying in the sky, not just from American fighters, but from something far more insidious, something no pilot could see or understand until the moment it killed him. For decades, Japan's naval air arm had been built on a simple belief: skill could overcome any weapon. Their pilots were the finest trained in the world. Their attack tactics, steep dives, weaving approaches, coordinated torpedo runs, were masterpieces of precision. All of that depended on one assumption: that the enemy's anti-aircraft guns remained predictable. By early 1944, that assumption had completely evaporated. The VT fuse had turned the sky itself into a hunter. The report that shook Japan in April 1944, Lieutenant Commander Masatake Okumiya, one of the most respected tactical thinkers in the Imperial Navy, presented a devastating analysis to Vice Admiral Kakuta, commander of the 1st Air Fleet. Okumiya was no alarmist. He had flown combat missions. He had studied American tactics. He knew the resilience of Japanese pilots. But what he reported chilled the room. American anti-aircraft fire had become so accurate, so lethal, that conventional attack methods were no longer viable. Pilots who once could depend on skill and instinct now died in midair without ever seeing what hit them. Attack profiles that had worked at Pearl Harbor, the Indian Ocean, and the Solomons were now suicide runs. Survival rates had dropped so drastically that Okumiya summarized the situation in one brutal line: "We cannot continue like this. We are trading irreplaceable pilots for nothing." He explained that a typical dive bomb attack exposed an aircraft to anti-aircraft fire for up to a full minute, long enough for VT-fused shells to bracket, track, and annihilate it. Even if a plane managed to release its bomb, it might still be destroyed before it could pull away. The numbers were unforgiving. Survival rates below 50%, only 10 to 15% of ships attacked suffered meaningful damage. Aircraft losses so severe that training pipelines couldn't replace them. Japan was bleeding pilots faster than it could bury them. Tactical changes and their failure. Japanese strategists tried to adapt. They always had. They ordered lower altitude runs, believing that hugging the sea would make it harder for radar-directed guns to track them. They urged faster, shallower dives, hoping speed would outrun American fire control. They rebuilt attack formations to try to saturate defenses with more aircraft at once. But every adaptation had a cost. Low-altitude attacks gave pilots less time to aim. High-speed dives reduced accuracy. Larger formations drained precious planes Japan no longer had. Night attacks risked getting lost and crashing into the sea. Worst of all, none of these changes defeated the VT fuse. It didn't matter how fast, how low, how erratically they flew. The shells detonated when close enough, tearing through wings and cockpits with ruthless precision. The pilots felt it. The commanders saw it, and the numbers kept getting worse. Japan had entered a war of attrition, and attrition was a war Japan could never win. The strategic box Japan couldn't escape. The Imperial Navy had always relied on elite craftsmanship, small numbers of highly trained pilots executing elegant, specialized attack profiles. This doctrine worked in 1941. It even worked in 1942. But in 1943, when the VT fuse arrived on the battlefield, that doctrine began to unravel. Each dead pilot represented not just a loss, but a disaster. A fully trained naval aviator took years to create. The men flying in 1941 had trained in the 1930s. Long before war began, many had over 1,000 hours of flight time. They were irreplaceable. But now those irreplaceable men were vanishing in seconds, caught by detonations they never saw coming. By 1944, Japan's training program had become a shadow of what it once was. Fuel shortages limited flight hours. Replacement pilots often had fewer than 100 training hours. They couldn't perform the advanced maneuvers of their predecessors. They couldn't dodge as skillfully. They couldn't survive. And the VT fuse punished inexperience mercilessly. The U.S. Navy, meanwhile, was only growing stronger. Every new ship delivered from American shipyards carried more VT ammunition, improved radar, and updated fire control systems. The effectiveness of VT fuses climbed from 30% to 70% reliability. What Japan perceived as black magic was actually getting deadlier every month. Japanese admirals faced a horrifying truth. The more they attacked, the faster they destroyed their own air arm. It wasn't just the battles they were losing, it was the future. The doctrinal breaking point. It was during one of these despairing briefings that Okumiya voiced what many in the room had already begun to think in the darkest corners of their minds. He pointed to an overlooked fact. In a conventional attack, when a bomber released its weapons, its survival depended on its ability to escape. But what if escape was no longer part of the tactic? What if the pilot didn't intend to live? What if the aircraft itself became the weapon? A pilot could climb slightly, aim directly at the ship, and dive with full power. He would no longer care about preserving control surfaces or engines damaged by shrapnel. He wouldn't care if he was wounded. He wouldn't care if the plane was burning. He only needed to stay airborne for 10 or 15 more seconds. The VT fuse could wound such an aircraft. But wounding was not enough. Unless the shell blasted the plane into fragments, the burning wreck might still smash into the ship. This was the seed, the terrible, undeniable logic, the one idea that made every man in the room fall silent. A pilot who does not intend to return cannot be stopped. This idea flowed upward through the command structure. Quiet at first, almost whispered. But the whispers hardened into discussion, and discussion became doctrine. Onishi would later give the tactic a name, a sacred name, a name that would terrify American sailors for the rest of the war. Toko, special attack, the Kamikaze. The fuse that changed a strategy. In a cruel twist of history, the VT fuse did more than kill Japanese aircraft. It forced Japan to abandon its entire air doctrine. It pushed them toward the one strategy immune to psychological pressure. Because a man already committed to death could not be demoralized. The VT fuse was so effective, so devastating, that Japan felt compelled to embrace the unthinkable, turning its pilots into weapons. It did not create the kamikaze idea, but it made everything else impossible. The sky, once Japan's greatest battlefield advantage, had become a graveyard, and their commanders, staring into the abyss of unsustainable losses, made a fateful choice. If their pilots could no longer survive long enough to drop bombs, then the pilots would become the bombs. The VT fuse did not just win engagements, it reshaped Japanese strategy, forcing them down a path from which there was no return. Main idea number 5, 1,000 words, war narrative style. The day the sky turned into a slaughterhouse. June 1944. The Philippine Sea stretched blue and endless, calm in a way that felt almost mocking. Beneath that still surface, two of the greatest naval forces ever assembled were preparing to tear each other apart. One was the Imperial Japanese Navy's last great carrier strike force, 9 carriers, hundreds of aircraft, every remaining veteran pilot they could scrape together. The other was the U.S. Fifth Fleet under Admiral Raymond Spruance, a steel giant armed not only with trained pilots and modern fighters, but with a new invisible weapon hiding inside its 5-inch shells, the VT proximity fuse. Japan came into the battle with one desperate hope: deliver a single crushing blow to halt the American advance toward the Marianas. Lose the Marianas, and the American B-29 superfortresses would be able to reach Tokyo itself. Japan had no choice. They had to strike. They had to win. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commanding the mobile fleet, believed he could still pull off a miracle. He had nearly 500 aircraft. He had veteran flight leaders, skilled deck crews, and a doctrine forged in the golden age of Japanese naval aviation. His pilots were brave, fanatical, ready to die. And for the first time in months, he believed the numbers favored him. What he didn't know was that the Americans had turned the sky into a killing field. The Americans wait with calm confidence on the decks of the U.S. carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, Yorktown, Essex, Cowpens, Hornet, and others. Pilots lounged, listened to radios, played cards, or leaned against aircraft painted with cartoon mascots. Yet none of them were relaxed. They had been told what was coming. They knew the Japanese would come with everything they had left. But there was no fear. Above them circled combat air patrols of F-6F Hellcats, disciplined and deadly, waiting at altitude like patient hawks. On the outer screen, the battleships and heavy cruisers prepared their 5-inch guns, their magazines loaded with VT-fused ammunition. Radar operators hunched over glowing screens, watching the distant blips. American fire control officers had studied the new doctrine well. Let the fighters punch holes in the Japanese raids. Let the VT fuses finish what the fighters did not. This was not 1942. It was not Midway. It was not the desperate chaos of the Guadalcanal nights. This time the Americans had every advantage, and they intended to use them all. The first wave. The slaughter begins on the morning of June 19th. Radar detected the first Japanese wave, 69 aircraft, approaching from over 60 miles away. The radio crackled. Large raid inbound. Fighters, vector to intercept. The Hellcats roared to life, climbing like predators who had finally scented prey. They hit the Japanese formation long before it reached the American fleet. The Japanese, flying older aircraft, burdened by fuel tanks and guided by inferior radar, were caught midair by a wall of American firepower. Dozens of Japanese planes fell before they ever saw a ship. But some slipped through. Some always did. For those pilots, battered, shaken, and desperate, the worst was still waiting. The steel umbrella. The surviving Japanese aircraft broke through the fighter screen and dove toward the American ships. They had done this countless times in the past. They expected bursts of timed shells, predictable, dodgeable, survivable. But what greeted them instead was the cold mechanical precision of VT fuses. The U.S. battleships on the perimeter opened fire. Indiana, South Dakota, North Carolina, Washington, and the cruisers beside them. Their 5-inch guns lit the sky. The shells didn't explode in neat lines or harmless patterns. They exploded exactly where the Japanese planes were, detonating in tight clusters around wings, fuselages, and cockpits. The Japanese pilots had no time to react. No evasive move mattered. No instinct could save them. Aircraft fell like burning leaves. Some disintegrated so quickly that American spotters couldn't tell whether the kill came from a shell or from structural failure. Others spiraled downward, trailing fire. A few broke apart in midair without any visible reason, just sudden shrapnel and silence. The Americans called it the steel umbrella. Under that umbrella, nothing lived for long. The second wave, doom repeats itself. Ozawa launched a second strike, 128 aircraft. He had no choice. The operation depended on overwhelming the Americans with mass. If the first wave failed, the second had to succeed. It didn't. Radar spotted them again over 100 miles away. Hellcats tore into them like wolves. Then the VT fuses finished the survivors. Some Japanese aviators, a handful, got close enough to see the American ships. They saw rows of carriers, cruisers, battleships, all steaming untouched and unafraid. They saw the tracers weaving a red net in the sky. They saw their comrades dying all around them. And then their planes exploded. One Japanese pilot who survived the battle later wrote in his diary, "It was not a battle. It was execution. The most one-sided aerial massacre in history." By the end of the day, the Japanese had lost nearly 350 aircraft, over 70% of their striking power. Entire squadrons simply vanished. Carrier decks that had launched waves of planes in the morning were nearly empty by afternoon. American losses? 30 aircraft. Total. A kill ratio of nearly 12-1. The press would later call it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a name born from pilots joking that shooting down Japanese planes was like hunting slow-moving birds back home. It was dark humor, but it had truth. The Japanese air arm had been annihilated with terrifying ease. Post-war analysis revealed that about half of the Japanese aircraft destroyed by the fleet that day were brought down by anti-aircraft fire, and most of those kills came from VT-fused shells. The weapon Japan once whispered about as black magic had just demonstrated its full power. A fleet without wings. Ozawa radioed Tokyo with a message that stunned even his superiors. Our air forces are no longer operational. This wasn't exaggeration. It wasn't fear. It was fact. Japan had lost the last fully trained generation of its carrier pilots, men who had survived since Pearl Harbor. The ones who replaced them would be half-trained boys who barely knew how to land on a carrier deck. The Battle of the Philippine Sea broke the back of Japanese naval aviation. And though the Hellcats delivered the first blow, the VT fuses delivered the finishing one. The end of a legend. For decades, the Imperial Japanese Navy had been feared as the most skilled carrier force in the world. Its pilots were warriors, artisans of the air, trained in brutal programs, and hardened by years of victories. In a single day, that legacy died, not by attrition, not by bad luck, but by a weapon that erased the very skill that had once made Japan dominant. The VT fuse didn't just blow planes out of the sky. It killed a doctrine, a generation, a belief system. And as the wreckage of hundreds of Japanese aircraft sank into the Philippine Sea, one thing became clear. Japan would never again challenge the United States for control of the skies. In the end, the VT proximity fuse was never as famous as the atomic bomb, never as iconic as the aircraft carrier, never as visually dramatic as a fleet burning at anchor. But in the brutal arithmetic of war, it mattered just as much. From the Solomons to the Marianas, from the waters around Okinawa to the skies over London and the fields of the Ardennes, this little device quietly rewrote the rules. It didn't make men braver, but it made their chances better. It didn't replace courage, but it stopped courage from being wasted against impossible odds. For Japanese pilots, it turned skill into a coin toss. For American gun crews, it turned helpless fire into something that could actually change the outcome of a battle. And for the commanders on both sides, it proved a harsh truth about modern war. That the side which marries science, industry, and tactics fastest doesn't just win fights, it reshapes what fighting even means. The Japanese who called VT fire black magic were wrong about one thing. There was no sorcery in those shells, only physics and human ingenuity. But in another sense, they weren't wrong at all. To a man who never sees the shell that kills him, to a pilot who dies in a flash of light without ever understanding why, there may be no difference between magic and a technology so far ahead, it feels like the universe itself has turned against you. The VT proximity fuse didn't win the war by itself. No single weapon ever does. But it was one of those quiet inventions that tilted a vast, bloody conflict a little more toward one side and brought thousands of men home who otherwise would have died under someone else's bombs. In a war where inches and seconds decided life or death, a fuse that could know when to explode was enough to change history.